Hi everyone, Chris here. Just wanted to let you know that this season of The Wild, we're bringing you 3 new things. Along with the launch of our series On Location in America's National Parks, we're also presenting interviews with the sharpest minds in wildlife conservation. And we'll dip into our archives to share some of our favourite wild episodes from the past. Enjoy.
This is the American dream of freedom on wheels. An automotive age, traveling on time-saving superhighways. Futurama's free-flowing channels of concrete and steel.
When cars first started appearing on the landscape, people hated them, right? They were these terrifying new death machines that were running over children and taking over city streets and killing lots of animals.
According to author Ben Goldfarb, it didn't take long for America to fully embrace the automobile, and with it, an ever-growing network of roads.
By the mid-1950s, cars have gone from being this kind of terrifying, invasive species on the American landscape to the epitome of the American dream. It's kind of incredible how fast that transformation happened.
We have become the nation on wheels.
In the 1950s, we're starting to create suburbs. Cities are getting full and people are kind of moving out.
Though we have the greatest highway system in all the world, it can't carry the mounting traffic of our growing greatness.
One of the paradoxes of interstate highways and cars in general is that they make us humans, free and mobile across the landscape, and they do the exact opposite to wild creatures.
I think it's safe to say that Americans love our cars. The mythology of the open road speaks to all of us, calling us for adventure. But American wildlife might have something else to say about that. 1 million animals are killed on roads every day in the US. But the problem with our transportation system goes way beyond roadkill. Ben Goldfarb says practically everything in the natural world is influenced by all these miles of gravel and tarmac. His latest book is Crossings: How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. So today, a fascinating conversation with an author who travelled the world for answers about roads. These roads take us to stories about cougars, butterflies, deer, and of course I snuck bears in there. From KUOW in Seattle and Chris Morgan Wildlife, welcome to The Wild. You might remember Ben from our episode way back in season 1 on beavers. It was one of our most popular episodes.
Still hear from people, wow, you were on the Wild with Chris. That's incredible. Of the many interviews I've done over the years, that one has more traction than most, for sure. It's fun.
That is so great to hear.
Yeah,
I love that. So, Ben, the subtitle of your book claims that roads are changing the future of our planet. That's a pretty big claim. What have you seen that led you to believe that?
The most striking example of that are cliff swallows. Cliff swallows are these birds who build their mud nests on the underside of highway bridges and overpasses. And, what researchers in Nebraska have found is that over time, the shape of those swallows' wings is changing. If you live above a highway, you're at risk, of course, of being hit by cars yourself. But different wing lengths and shapes are better for avoiding roadkill, right? If you're a swallow with long wings, long wings are good for flying long straight distances, but you're not very maneuverable, whereas short wings are good for agility, doing lots of tight rolls and turns like you would getting out of the way of an 18-wheeler. And so what's happened over time is that, right, those long-wing swallows are getting hit by cars and trucks, and those short-wing swallows are avoiding cars and trucks. And so the whole population is evolving to become shorter winged, which, is just incredible, right?
You are kidding. That's insane.
Yeah, because, it is insane because you think about evolution as being this process that unfolds over centuries or millennia or millions of years, right? And yet cars and traffic is they're such a powerful selective force that they're causing evolution to transpire. And I think that's just really incredible.
So I guess that's a good example of what you call road ecology in your book. Where did that name come from?
The term road ecology was really coined in the 1990s by Richard Foreman, who's this landscape ecologist at Harvard, very famous guy. And one day he was in his office with a bunch of students, and they were looking at this aerial photograph of a forest somewhere in New England. And he was kind of expounding on all the features of this picture. Here's what trees are growing where, here's where the water runs, here's where different wildlife species have their habitat. And then he kind of stopped and noticed this road running right through the middle of this picture and said, we know a lot about everything else in this photograph, but we don't really know much about that thing, that road, because I think in some ways roads are so ubiquitous, we kind of take them for granted, right? We use them every day. They're a little bit invisible to us. And so I think historically, lots of scientists and even conservationists didn't give them much thought. And Richard was really the guy who looked at the road in a new way and said, hey, wait a second, this is this really distinctive feature that confers all of these unique and distinctive ecological impacts, and we should probably be studying those.
Yeah, it makes sense. I'm a map guy. I love maps. I bet you do too, right? But you pull out a map of North America and the whole eastern side of it is just riddled with roads and dense. And then the western half is still got a lot of roads, but it's a lot less dense than the eastern half. But all you have to do is look at that map and realize, oh my goodness, the impact of this side of human development has just got to be colossal. And you don't have to be an ecologist to figure that out. Just look at any map of North America, right?
Yeah, it's really incredible. And here in the lower 48, you can't get more than 20 miles from the nearest road. That's in Yellowstone National Park. There's a little corner, the thoroughfare in kind of the southern half of the park where you can be 20 miles from a road. And that's the farthest you can be from one in the lower 48 because, as you say, these things are just everywhere, right? And, I think one of the really important things to remember is that it's not just asphalt itself, it's the whole kind of shadow that the asphalt casts. A road itself might only be 100 feet wide from shoulder to shoulder, and yet it's preventing animals from accessing all of this critical habitat, right? That wall of traffic is just cutting them off, and you have that wide kind of acoustic envelope. All of that road noise pollution is chasing animals away from huge areas, right? So, you might look at a map of Nevada or Idaho, let's say, and say, well, there aren't really that many big highways on the map. And yet those highways are having ecological impacts that so dramatically transcend that little linear strip of pavement. I think that's one of the things I really try to get at in this book is just the outsized impacts of roads compared to their physical dimensions.
Yes, so well said. And the title of your book says it all right, Crossings. We've got a highway here that you may have seen or even driven, Highway 20, that crosses North Cascades, including North Cascades National Park, and it bisects a lot of wildlife habitat as a result. And on the east side, near these towns of Mazama and Winthrop and Twisp, there's large mule deer populations. And, hundreds per year are often killed by cars and people die as well. So it's a human and a wildlife thing. I read that we've got 7,000 miles of highway in Washington alone and a lot of wildlife. So it's a perfect match for disaster in some ways. But every time I'm driving down that highway, I'm thinking about exactly what you just talked about, that these deer, it's not randomly trying to cross roads, just to get from one side to the other because there's a patch of grass. But they have this bigger picture, don't they, in mind of the habitat, the larger sort of landscape level habitat that they're trying to maneuver through. And we don't account for that. We don't plan for that, do we? It's the last thing on our minds as we're trying to put a road in somewhere. Still today, right?
I'm so glad you mentioned Highway 20 because I think that's just such a good example of the phenomenon you're talking about, right? I mean, here's this highway that we built through the Methow Valley along the river because the rest of it is mountains. You kind of have to build where the building is easy, and that tends to be, in these valley areas, which is, why Highway 20 is so dangerous because you have the highway and the best wildlife habitat running in parallel with each other. And that's exactly what we've done all over the country. And I remember going there, working on this book in the evening. There are these really discrete deer collision hotspots, just happens over and over again. And, up on the hillsides, you'll just see dozens of ravens and magpies and bald eagles and even golden eagles just hanging out. They just know there's going to be a carcass tonight that they're going to be feasting on come morning. And so the birds have really figured out where the hot spots are. And, why can't we, right?
Well, I guess there's one benefit then to roadkill for some creatures, and I know people even collect roadkill to eat these days, don't they? But we'll get to that later,
Yeah.
I'm sure. But it is all part of the road becomes part of the ecology, doesn't it? When you've got eagles and ravens that know that a road is a source of food. That's fascinating stuff, isn't it?
Right. But it's also, it's a dangerous source of food, right? If you're an eagle with a belly full of venison, it's hard to achieve liftoff. You're at risk of becoming roadkill yourself. So as you say, the road it's an ecosystem in a sense, but it's a dangerous ecosystem. And there's always a risk of it becoming, what scientists call it an ecological trap, right? This area that lures animals in with carrion and other resources and then unfortunately kills them. Yeah.
And we're not just talking about common animals. We all see dead squirrels at the side of the road, and it's a sad thing to see. But it's make or break for some wild animal populations, isn't it? Right? I mean, literally the deaths on roads that are caused by cars and other vehicles, it can be life or death for some populations, right?
Absolutely, yeah. I think you're right that because the animals we see most often are the common ones, squirrels and the raccoons and the deer. I think we have this way of kind of dismissing roadkill as an ecological and biodiversity crisis. Like, oh yeah, we're hitting, a million animals a day in the US, which is kind of the number, which is just staggering to think about. Again, we're killing lots of squirrels and, there's still plenty of squirrels out there. So what's the big deal? I think that we sort of implicitly have that attitude. But as you're alluding to, there are plenty of really rare and endangered species out there that are existentially threatened by cars. The Asiatic cheetah, one of the rarest species of mammal in the world, and a few dozen of them left. And last year, one of the last reproductive females was killed by a car. She was pregnant at the time with kittens. And so that might have been the last gasp for that species, was that individual reproductive female who got killed. And, I think that goes to show that it's not just how many animals get killed by cars, it's which ones, right? Because those really important reproducing animals can get killed. In nature, predators like wolves and bears and mountain lions, they're targeting the old and the sick and the weak. They're very selective predators in a sense, whereas cars are totally indiscriminate predators who kill the healthy as well as the sick and the young as well as the old. And that's one of the things that makes roadkill so pernicious as this conservation issue.
Wow. We all, especially in North America, I'm European. You might have noticed from my accent.
What gave you away? Yeah.
So I feel like North America is a little bit of a window. It's a couple of hundred years, maybe more later than where I'm from, and I see all the things that went wrong on our continent, my homeland continent, my home country of the UK. And I think about suburbs in the US and how they spring up because there's still the space for suburbia. What role does the development of these suburban neighborhoods play in the creation of roads?
Look, suburbs have been closely tied to highways forever, right? And in some ways, it was the development of those interstate highway systems that allowed the suburbs to arise in the first place, by making it easy for people to commute from more rural areas into cities. And now, obviously, suburbs are these huge sort of zones of road in their own right. We're not building lots of new giant highways in North America or in Europe. But, we're building lots of new, smaller residential roads, right? And those suburbs kind of invite more traffic in a sense. That's something that's happening here in Colorado, where I live in the Arkansas Valley. Just like the Methow Valley, we have this one big highway that kind of runs along the river through the middle of the valley. And, we're developing rapidly. There are lots of new subdivisions being built on former ranch land in many cases. And those subdivisions, of course, they both require their own roads. So we're seeing lots of new residential roads, but they also invite more traffic into the valley along that main highway, right? So the highway becomes an increasing risk of both roadkill and that kind of habitat fragmentation that we were talking about, where the elk especially just can't get across it now because there's just so many vehicles going up and down Highway 285. So that's the thing about suburbs, is that they both require roads themselves and they also exacerbate traffic on the existing highways.
I live that where I am right now, you're just making me think of this, Ben. Yesterday, I live on a hill just on the edge of Bellingham. And yesterday I was looking from town up towards our hill, mountain hill. And there are buildings on another hill just in front of it, almost to the top of that hill now. It's all cougar and black bear habitat, and our hill is as well. But you can just see the creep of these buildings upwards. It's not just sort of a flat plain, is it? You know, these suburban areas are growing and evolving and being built in hillsides and mountains and into all kinds of ecosystems. And it's they weren't there a few years ago, all of these houses on this hill, and it just really struck me, especially as I knew I was going to be talking to you. You know, it's just happening all around us, isn't it?
It really is, yeah. You know, and back when we lived in Spokane, you know, we were seeing that dramatically as people kind of fled Seattle and Portland and California, you know, moving to Eastern Washington. The land values just get jacked up so high that when an old ranch, for example, comes on the market, the land trusts and other conservation groups who used to be able to buy it and protect it, you know, they just can't compete with the developers anymore, right? And so, you know, you see really rapid development and, you know, the construction of new homes pressing out into Spokane Valley and other places around Eastern Washington. And that's one of the kind of the frustrating things to observe here in Colorado too, is that, look, you know, if all of this new development was, you know, affordable housing, okay, great. You know, at least we'd be addressing, you know, a housing crisis. But, you know, what we're seeing down here is just so many new second homes and investment properties that become Airbnbs and, you know, and that sort of thing. So we're losing all of this habitat, but we're not actually gaining much housing stock. We're just kind of exacerbating the housing problem, if anything.
Right. God, a whole different topic.
Yeah, no kidding. Right. But that's, you know, but I think that's, you know, I think that's kind of the cool thing, maybe not the cool thing, but the interesting thing about road ecology is that it's linked to all of these other patterns of, you know, civilizational development and transportation and mobility. You know, it just gets at the heart of so many of the assorted social and ecological problems that we're facing in the American West.
Right. A very visible representation of all of that.
Yeah.
One clear example in your book of the impacts of roads is the cougar population in Santa Monica. What's happening there?
Yeah, that's a very famous population of mountain lions that really illustrates these problems well. So that cluster of mountain lions lives in the Santa Monica Mountains, as you say, just west of Los Angeles, and they're surrounded by some of the busiest freeways on Earth, the 101, the 405. These are freeways that have 300,000 cars every day and are basically these just impenetrable walls of traffic. And so what's happening to those cats is they've become effectively isolated, right? They can't disperse out of this little patch of habitat because they can't cross the highways. And, you know, no new mountain lions can enter the habitat because they can't get across the highways, right? And so as a result, you know, these cougars have been stuck basically breeding with themselves for many years. And, you know, what they found is that there are individual male mountain lions who have mated with their own daughters and granddaughters and great-granddaughters. There's just this kind of incestuous relationship among these many cats, and they've begun to suffer genetic defects as a result of all of this inbreeding. They've entered what scientists have called this extinction vortex, this, you know, long-term doom spiral, basically caused by their isolation, which is caused by freeways.
How many cats are in that population?
You know, it kind of varies from year to year, but typically a dozen or so adults and then some kittens. And, you know, that's another issue as well, is that those young mountain lions, you know, what they really want to do, especially the males, is, you know, they want to disperse out to find their own territory, right? They want to make their own mark and get to their own place and get away from their fathers who view them as competition and rivals. And because those mountain lions can't cross the highway, they're basically stuck in this kind of too small a space. You know, one of the things, I mean, really the two leading causes of death for these mountain lions are collisions on highways and being killed by other mountain lions because, you know, again, they're just all trapped together in this little bubble of habitat.
Wow, it is a very small number in a very small space, isn't it? A small number of cats. It's already sort of on the verge of not being able to persist, isn't it? And it's amazing that they're still there at all.
It really is, yeah. I mean, especially given how close they are to this enormous urban area, right? And, you know, and how much pressure that habitat gets. I mean, I think it's kind of an amazing testament to the animals themselves, you know, and how good they are at staying out of trouble and making a living. One of course, the most famous member of that population was P22, right? The P stands for Puma, and the number is just sort of the number in this long-term study. So, P22 is this very famous mountain lion who actually crossed those freeways and got out of the Santa Monicas and ended up in Griffith Park, that's the park where the Hollywood sign is, right? And sees millions of visitors every year. And, this poor male cat, P22, was living in this little urban park, certainly little by the standards of what cougars want as habitat. And he was there for many, many years. And, basically nobody ever saw him. He was just doing his thing. He would go out at night, hunt deer and raccoons. And then during the day, he would bed down in an oak thicket and stay out of sight, and basically never caused any problems until he was actually injured by a car. And then toward the end of his life, he started hunting chihuahuas, unfortunately. And that didn't go very well. And he ended up being captured and euthanized. But, just to say that here was this giant apex predator that lived in this incredibly urban place for many, many years and didn't cause any problems. And I think that's just a testament to the animals themselves and how resourceful and resilient they are.
I want to come back to something you mentioned briefly earlier on, because it's not just the physical presence of roads like those that surround the cats in Santa Monica, but road ecologists have even looked at the effect that just the noise of traffic can have. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think first thing to remember about road noise, right, is that it's a huge human health crisis in a sense that, we really ignore and kind of dismiss. But, road noise is elevating our blood pressures and heart rates and cortisol levels and making us more susceptible to stroke and cardiac disease and diabetes and all of these different problems. There have been studies showing that road noise is literally taking years off of people's lives in urban areas. And, it's really affecting wild animals in similar ways, right? Imagine being a male songbird, an animal who has to sing to attract a mate, or, being an owl who has to listen for the sound of a mouse's footsteps in the leaf litter, right? If you can't hear your mate, or if you can't hear your prey over that constant drone of engines and tires along I-90, you fundamentally can't live in that place, right? It's just this huge form of habitat loss that we really take for granted.
How has the effect of noisy roads been monitored, the effect of it on wildlife?
Yes, there's a really famous study that gets at this issue called the Phantom Road Experiment, which was done in Idaho by researchers at Boise State University. And basically what they did was they recorded the noise of traffic, and not from I-90, but actually from Glacier National Park, protected area. And they played that traffic noise through speakers that they mounted in the forest during songbird migration season. And what they found was that birds generally avoided that area because, they didn't like the road noise. But, really interesting was that the birds who kind of stuck around and hung out in that area despite the road noise were in worse body condition. They didn't gain weight like they needed to complete their migration. And the reason for that, right, is that if you're a little songbird, like a yellow-rumped warbler, you have to spend your whole life looking out for predators, right? Or at least listening for predators. You're listening constantly for the sound of a hawk's wings or a bobcat creeping through the underbrush. But, if you can't hear those acoustic signals because they're drowned out by road noise pollution, you have to look out for predators instead. And because you're spending so much time looking for predators, you're not feeding on insects and berries as much. So again, you're losing weight and you're not as equipped to finish that migration. So that was just an incredibly powerful study because again, it showed that even if you take away the pavement and the air pollution and the cars and the traffic, just that noise pollution by itself is incredibly disruptive to animals' lives.
I like how you compare it to, you're comparing human cortisol levels to animal cortisol levels. I'm sure if people measured cortisol in animals, it would be high like we're measuring it in humans and higher by busy places. It's funny, isn't it? You put someone from a city into the woods, and I've done it plenty of times, guiding people into very wild places, and suddenly you can just see it in their face. It's just something that overcomes them, the silence.
Yeah.
the realization that they live in a noisy place and this is not that. They get back to nature and they sort of, you can feel it and you can see it in someone real. And I feel it all the time. It's so odd, Ben, when now I'm doing a podcast, this last few years, I feel like I'm tuned into even the slightest of noises. And I find them more irritating than I used to. I can hear traffic from so far away. It's just like, it's a whole other layer of something to be thinking about. But wow, we are tuned in. So I can only imagine what wild animals, how tuned in they are to this whole concept of human-made noise.
Well, I think you're right, Chris, that we're so awash in road noise pollution that we don't notice it. We've really tuned it out. I mean, I wrote a big chunk of this book while living in Spokane, and we live kind of a stone's throw from I-90 on this busy arterial road that was funneling people from the South Hill, onto the interstate. I started reading all of these noise pollution studies and suddenly feeling like, oh crap, like this is killing us. I've kind of tuned it out, because you sort of have to tune it out just to survive. But, when you notice it, you recognize that, this is, enormously disruptive. And so when we moved to Colorado, I was like, okay, we're finding a quiet street in a little town, and we're getting away from this noise pollution that is was literally killing us in Spokane.
Let's talk about some of the solutions. You've touched upon a couple of them. Your overpasses was one of them, but there are other things that are happening out there in the world. First, I've got to ask this. I threw this one in as well, because I think everyone wonders, what do you know about deer learning to cross the road? Can they?
Yeah,
in the case of deer in particular, I mean, because you sometimes look at a deer and you don't think there's much going on between those big ears. Is there more going on between those ears than we think? Can they learn to cross a road safe?
Yeah, it's a good question. I definitely think that there is learning that happens in these populations. I mean, not obviously not enough learning, not fast enough, because clearly lots and lots of deer are still getting hit. There's a deer collision every 30 seconds in the U.S. somewhere, right? Which is just again
wow.
kind of an incredible testament to how significant a problem this is. So, look, I mean, other animals, I think as you're kind of alluding to, there are other smarter critters out there, right? Or at least, more flexible, adaptive animals. Coyotes, for example. There's an urban population of coyotes in Chicago that very famously looks both ways before crossing the street and, uses the crosswalks at red lights. Those are some pretty smart critters. I'm not sure.
Wait, is that true?
That is true. Yeah, it's true.
Really?
I'm not sure if deer are quite that bright, but I do. I just observe the deer, in my own neighborhood, and there's no question that they're waiting for intervals in traffic that are wide enough to permit them to cross safely. So, I do think that, some of these urban populations are getting better at avoiding cars over time. At least I hope so.
And it's like natural selection through roadkill, right?
Exactly.
It's like those that survive happen to know how to cross a road, right? The ones that don't end up dead and not passing on their genes. We can't just not use roads. Onto the sort of solutions that are out there. We can't not use them. I mean, the country that we live in is riddled with roads. We need it for economic purposes and for communication, all kinds of reasons, right? But how can we use them responsibly? Is there a easy answer to that? Is there an overarching answer to that? What would you say when someone asks you that? How can we use these roads responsibly?
Yeah, it's difficult because look, as you say, we're in this incredibly automotive country where there aren't great transit options in many places. And, look, I'm a hypocrite about this sort of thing. I've probably driven 30,000 miles this year promoting my book about the ills of driving, right? So, we're all kind of part of the issue in a lot of respects. And, to me, the solution isn't necessarily individual driving behavior. It's really more about creating options that don't involve cars necessarily, and I think that's, especially true, certainly in cities like Seattle, and it's, also true in protected areas, places where animals should be safe. And they are safe from hunting and development and other pressures, but they're not safe from cars, right? We have these big roads running through the middle of Yellowstone and Yosemite and Glacier and North Cascades, with Highway 20 and, all of these otherwise protected areas that, we have been kind of conditioned, I think, to experience, from behind the wheel. These are places that you road trip to, right? Mm-hmm. And, one of the places that I write about in the book is Denali National Park in Alaska, and there you basically can't take your personal car. You get to a parking lot, you park your car, and you get on a shuttle. And these buses go back and forth along the park road, and they're managed in such a way that there are kind of long gaps between them so that sheep and grizzly bears and other animals can cross the road. So there's not just this constant stream of buses, right? I think that sort of thing should be basically standard in national parks. There's no reason we should be driving our personal vehicles through national parks and, destroying the very wildlife that these parks were created to protect in so many cases. So, more transit
the irony
options.
of it.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
right.
I'm in the middle of watching the Ken Burns documentary series on national
cool.
parks, which I watched years ago, but I'm refreshing myself because I'm spending a lot of time in national parks this year for our season of the wild. It's all about national parks. And God, it's just fascinating learning about how even park officials, government officials were working with, kind of in cahoots with the auto industry back then, right? To try and encourage more people to come to the park so they could get the funding and attention that they needed. But it meant that these parks became, just swarmed with these early cars in the early 1900s, right? That were starting to take hold, where they were designing roads to accommodate all these cars. And I watched this one clip in the documentary of cars just parked all over meadows. Was it Rainier National Park or one of the, just trashing the place in those early days, the irony of it. And then it looks like it got too much to handle, and now there's permit systems in place for allowing cars into certain parts of parks, right? And we're having to sort of retrofit our management of cars in national parks. It's been a journey, hasn't it?
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, as you're alluding to, I mean, the biggest lobbyist for the expansion of the early National Park Service was the American Automobile Association, because Americans needed places to drive their cars, right? And those were the parks in so many cases. So there is this century-long legacy of parks being these places that some historians have called windshield wildernesses, landscapes that were designed to be seen from within cars. And, I think we're now coming to realize just how unsustainable that model is.
We talked before about the cougars in Santa Monica, and they're surrounded by roads and trapped by this island habitat. But there's a solution there that people are working on.
Yeah, so that population of mountain lions in California, they're going to benefit from what is going to be the largest wildlife overpass in North America. This gigantic structure that's under construction right now, should be completed by the end of 2025. That's going to cross the 101, this incredibly busy freeway, and basically allow those mountain lions in the Santa Monicas to move back and forth across the highway and meet up with cats from other parts of the state. And, ideally that kind of infusion of fresh blood and new genetic material will kind of refresh the gene pool and allow these inbred cats to avoid extinction.
Can you describe what that's going to look like? I've not tracked that story at all. I've not seen images of that highway overpass. And what sort of size are you talking about?
Yeah, it's really massive. It's a couple 100 feet wide, and they're really rebuilding the whole sort of area because they're kind of creating new slopes that sort of funnel animals towards the crossing. The whole project footprint, I think, is about 9 acres. So, sometimes people hear the phrase, wildlife overpass and wildlife bridge and think of like a little skinny catwalk. But, this project is really, as one of its designers described it, it's kind of architecturally solid terrain that cars must pass through. It's this giant piece of landscape that's going to have shrubs and trees and rocks and boulders and, all kinds of habitat features because, it's not just the mountain lions who have to use this thing. It's also the deer and the bobcats and the songbirds who are in many cases reluctant to fly over 10 lanes of traffic. It's the lizards and the ants. They're even thinking about, creating ant habitat atop this crossing, right? Really trying to make it an ecosystem as much as possible. And, the other kind of important consideration there too, right, is that, look, this freeway, the 101, it's so busy that there's so much noise and light pollution that would scare animals away from even approaching the overpass potentially. So they're also adding, vegetated screens and berms and rock walls and other features that are designed to block all of this sensory pollution that would deter animals. So it's really, they're really designing a new ecosystem from scratch that's going to span the highway. It's pretty exciting.
And kind of recreating that over the top of a highway, it's just fascinating. Every time I drive under one of those, I kind of celebrate in my mind. I'm like, yes! I mean, it looks beautiful as well. It just shows you how connected we are to nature. It just looks beautiful. It's a functional ecosystem crossing a highway. Animals are using it. It's a real feel good thing. Is there such a thing as a good road for wildlife?
Oh man, that's such a fraught question. I mean, I'm not sure that there is a road that is good for wildlife in general. I think that there are roads that probably benefit certain species. We were talking about scavengers earlier, all of the ravens and magpies and bald eagles and coyotes who use roads as resources, right? There are some great cases of insects using roadsides as habitat in the American Midwest. So much of the landscape is corn and soy and lawn monoculture, and those roadsides are some of the last kind of uncultivated strips of native prairie in some places, and end up being good habitats for monarch butterflies and other pollinators, right? So there are definitely cases of certain species benefiting from certain roads. But I'd be reluctant to say that, any road is kind of a net positive for wild animals.
What about the monarch butterflies? What can you tell us about them?
So, monarch butterflies, right, they're really dependent on a single species of plant, right, milkweed, or a single kind of group of species of plant. And, their caterpillars sort of exclusively eat those milkweeds. And the problem is, we've lost a huge amount of milkweed, right, because it's, it's been turned into agricultural lands or lawns or what have you. And so, roadsides are potentially these great sources of milkweed, right? And, it just so happens that, in many places, migrating monarchs basically move in parallel with roads. The Midwestern monarch migration, which goes from Minnesota to the Mexican border in Texas, was more or less in parallel with I-35, which has been called the Monarch Highway. And so, you can...
No way, really?
Yeah, it's amazing. And you could imagine kind of linear corridor of milkweed, right, leading these butterflies across the landscape. But, at the same time, lots of these animals are being killed, right? We don't really think about insects as being roadkill, but we know that millions of monarch butterflies become roadkill every year. They get hit by cars. And the road is also this kind of complex chemical environment. Our cars are bleeding cadmium and copper and zinc and microplastics and all kinds of stuff. And we're salting roads. And so the plants are potentially, they may have very high sodium contents. So it's an ecosystem, but it's kind of this weird, novel ecosystem that may not be, entirely beneficial. And so, there are definitely lots of transportation departments out there who are kind of invested in this idea of roadsides as habitat. And I think in the big picture, that is generally a good idea. But there are also scientists saying, hey, let's just make sure that we're actually producing more monarch butterflies than we're killing, right? Let's make sure that, that the math actually works out in favor of roadsides, because, we don't want to potentially create an ecological trap that's luring these butterflies in with milkweed only to see them die of salt poisoning or get hit by cars or what have you.
Wow. Layered is the word, isn't it? Super layered, the whole topic.
Yeah, it's so complex, and again, it just kind of intersects with all of these, these other forces of human settlement and dispersal and civilization, and yeah, that's why it's a rich topic, Chris, for sure.
Yeah. I don't know you well, but I know your work, and I can see how your mind works. You think ecologically, don't you? I mean, you could have written a book about anything, right? Why roads?
Geez, that's a good question, Chris. I should probably have thought about that before I did it. No, look, I think that that one of the things that has always fascinated me about roads is their invisibility. We've been talking about, these are structures that we use every single day, right? And I think as a result, we don't really think about them very much. And when we do think about them, we think about them in really positive terms. You think about all of our great writers and artists and musicians, from Kerouac to Springsteen. We have this kind of American cult of the open road, right? And that kind of road blindness, in a sense, even extends to conservation groups. Historically, there are all of these organizations who work on deforestation and poaching and, of course, climate change, all these other issues. And obviously, those are incredibly important, worthy issues, and I'm glad there are groups working on them. But historically, I think there were very few groups really focused on roads because, again, they're just, first, they were sort of invisible to us. And then, they're just such a big, difficult, intractable problem in so many ways that I think, lots of conservation organizations kind of shied away from them. And yet they're at the heart of so many other ecological problems, right? Before you can illegally log the Amazon, you have to cut the road to get the logging truck in and the logs out. Before you can poach an elephant in Africa, you need a road to access the elephant, right? Transportation is something like a quarter of all American carbon emissions, so roads are at the heart of all of these disparate environmental problems. And yet, to me, it felt like, as an environmental journalist, very few groups were focused on them and targeting them.
I leave this afternoon. I'm driving to Death Valley today.
Oh, cool.
1,200 miles. So you've given me a lot to think about on the road.
Just be careful, Chris. Okay, I don't want to hear that you've hit a pronghorn or something.
Ben, thank you so much again. Thanks for the work that you do and for the incredible conversation. It's always a pleasure.
Thanks a lot, Chris. Likewise.
Thanks to my guest, environmental journalist and author Ben Goldfarb. His most recent book is Crossings: How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet. We talked to Ben in our first season of The Wild about beavers. It was a fun episode. If you want to check it out, it's in our feed. Don't forget to check out our Instagram posts, always some enticing images and thoughts from the field, including our new episodes this season on America's national parks. Find us at The Wild Pod and at Chris Morgan Wildlife. The Wild is a production of KUOW in Seattle and Chris Morgan Wildlife with support from Wildlife Media. This show would not be possible without listener support. You can help us continue to create this special immersive storytelling by donating to KUOW. Go to KUOW/donate/The Wild. Thank you. Our producer is Matt Martin. Jim Gates is our editor. The Wild is hosted, produced and written by me, Chris Morgan. A very special thank you for their kind financial support to Jill and Scott Walker, Rose Letwin, Ellen Ferguson, Anna Kimball, John Taylor, Paul Lister, Bob Yellowlees, Barbara Stolman and Barton Brooks. Our production team includes David Brown, April Craig, Marshall Eisen, Michaela Gianotti Boyle, Tatiana Latre, Lucy Suchek, Kara McDermott, Amelia Peacock, Darcy Riggins-Schmidt, Brendan Sweeney and Hans Tweit. Our theme music is by Michael Parker. I'm Chris Morgan. Take care of yourselves. I hope we've inspired you and maybe given you some new things to think about as we spin around on this beautiful planet together.